Hello students. Tonight we're going to be talking about the Great Depression, most specifically the causes and effects. It was the worst economic crisis in United States history. Millions of people were out of work, struggling to keep a roof over their head, wondering where their next meal was coming from. Not only did we have these economic hardships, but everybody, young, old, rich, poor, was affected in some shape or form by the Great Depression. It really changed America. Prior to the Great Depression, we felt if we worked hard enough, we would always have a job and move up that economic ladder. The Great Depression really shattered our image of the American dream. And it affected the freedom of many Americans, having to wait in the soup line, as you see in that picture in the corner, looking for a job from day to day, working 4 odd jobs to support the family, kids having to drop out of school to help support the family. It's really why we want to look at this time in United States history. That's our main idea that I want you really to look at and think about as I discuss the causes of the Great Depression and its effects. One major cause is speculation that the economy was always going to do well, and people not really being prepared if they went out of business, they lost their job. So vital industries kept making more stuff, assuming that they would always be able to sell. When they didn't have enough money, they would borrow to produce more stuff to make more money. And it was a vicious cycle that came to a crash by the end of the 1920s. Major companies that produced lumber, automobiles, housing, agriculture went out of business. People couldn't pay for their bills. The companies couldn't pay the loans back. Banks couldn't hold on to their money. It was, like I said, a vicious domino effect. With this overproduction in industry and agriculture, like I said before, people were producing more than people could consume. So you had a lot of waste. And they couldn't sell it overseas because overseas, the United States was already seeing an economic depression, and specifically Europe, who was still recovering from World War I. Another major cause was an unequal distribution of wealth. The majority of Americans didn't hold the wealth. Only a small percentage of Americans held most of the wealth in the United States. That means there was really no real spending, only the top few. So people didn't have a realistic idea of how the economy was taking a turn for the worse. People that didn't have enough money to buy things kind of had the attitude, I can buy now, pay later. So a lot of people started borrowing on credit for an appliance, for that nice jacket, and people just didn't pay back their debts as their hours may have got cut at the factory, or they started to lose their job. And then the people they owed money to, the stores, the grocery stores, they couldn't pay their bills. Once again, that vicious cycle. It comes to a crash in 1929 when the stock market completely falls flat. Buying stocks was a very popular way to earn money in the 1920s. It hit its peak in 1928. And people started to panic after the peak. People started hearing rumors that stocks weren't going to be worth that much. And so you had kind of this economic hysteria. In 1929, it all came to a crash. People were trying to sell their stocks because they felt it wasn't worth money, and the prices of stocks fell. Now, a lot of people think this is when the Great Depression started. Not technically. People really didn't start feeling the effects until about 1932, 1933-ish. But it definitely was a contributing factor, just not the factor of the Great Depression. Another cause that impacted our overall economy was high tariffs. That's a fancy word for foreign taxes. Combined with unpaid war debts from other countries would have a huge impact on U.S. economy. So high tariff, if another country wants to sell their goods in our country, then they have to pay a higher tax. And the U.S. government thought they could put that back in the economy. Well, other countries disagreed. They decided it was too much. They'd rather not sell to us. And in the long run, that would hurt us in the United States. And that fancy tax is also known as the Hawley-Smoot tariff. Now, combine this with unpaid war debts from World War I is an economic catastrophe. We were very stable after World War I. Our economy wasn't really impacted by World War I like other countries. We didn't have battles fought on our soil. Therefore, other countries turned to us and we gladly helped them out with the expectation that all the money we loaned out would be paid back. But because Europe was already going through their own economic crisis, that wasn't the case. So we see widespread hunger, poverty, and homelessness and unemployment as a result of this. Many people not knowing where their next piece of bread was coming from, how they could provide for their families. We would also see a mass migration of people moving from the Midwest towards California. Not only did we have the economic hardships, kind of just had bad luck. There was a major drought in the Midwest, which if you don't have water, you can't grow crops, which is going to affect the food supply, which is going to drive the prices up of food because you have less supply. And people that had spent generations on farms had to leave it behind because the drought created almost like this desert-like presence. And you have these strong winds in the Midwest, and it creates what was called the Dust Bowl, these huge dust storms that would further damage farms, homes, and literally cover towns with dust. So people would gather what they could carry and started walking out west. As a result of these hardships, Americans were desperate for change. In the 1920s, we had a trend of Republican presidents, but people said, that's enough. We need somebody that's going to help us. We can't help ourselves. We want to work. We want to desperately feed our families. So they elected Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had great energy and great ideas. His approach was the New Deal, which essentially gave the government more power to have a say-so over programs like jobs, welfare, how much taxes we have to pay. And we'll get into more detail about the New Deal in the next lesson. Now, a bigger overarching consequence of the Great Depression and effect is the rise of totalitarian dictatorships in other parts of the world, where the government didn't have a plan or the resources to help their people out. So people listen to extreme ideas from extreme people just so they could feed their family. And in turn, this will lead to World War II, and we'll talk about those connections later on. Here's a picture of what's called a Hooverville, mocking President Hoover because he was a president before FDR, as we talked about in the past, and he really had a hands-off approach when it came to the Great Depression. And that's one of the reasons why Franklin D. Roosevelt got elected, because he had that hands-on. So this is one of your typical Hoovervilles or homeless camps you would see during this time in the United States. Many people would see the face of despair, especially in the children, no hope for the future. Here's a little camp alongside the road that you would see. Like I said, when people had to leave their homes behind when they moved from the Midwest to California, they couldn't carry much with them, especially if they didn't have a car. The sad reality is, you can see it on this young mother's face. She's only in her 30s. She looks a lot older. from the stress of where am I going to find a home? How am I going to provide food for my family? Not much I have. Earlier when I was talking about the Dust Bowl in the Midwest caused by the drought and the storms, this is what typical farms would look like. You can't really grow anything on that, especially if you have no water and you don't have the money to repair your farm. People lost everything and was left with just about nothing. In the city, you would see kids running around, trying to collect things, sell things, not going to school, trying to help out their family any way they could. It became a way of just getting by. A way of life was survival. A lot of young people would travel across the United States, going from town to town, farm to farm, which was scary. So they came up with their own survival system where they would write pictures saying, I ate here, if they left 18, or a cross, meaning talk religion and get food. And Americans, true to their soul, lived this and figured out how to survive as you look at these hobo signs. So tomorrow I want you to be prepared to discuss the causes and effects and some of the big ideas. And please be prepared to ask me any questions or further elaborate on anything that you didn't understand from this presentation. And I look forward to discussing the big ideas with you tomorrow.